I am like over the moon excited to have with me Gene Kannenberg Jr., who is teaching there at Columbia College, Chicago, as well as media assistant at Northwestern, and back to school for a master's degree in library science. So welcome, Gene.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for the invitation. This is a great podcast. This should be collected as like a book or something.
Well, I hope that'll happen because I think you're right. I think it's great. And I know a lot of people are already using these in their classes. I know my intro
Definitely.
comic studies has it like all the way through the syllabus. So, Gene, tell us how did you get into comics studies? And then we're going to go on and talk about how you got into comics creation. But comics studies, let's start with that big question.
Okay, a million years ago, it's kind of what it feels like. When I was in graduate school at the University of Connecticut in the 1990s, I've been reading comics off and on my whole life since I was a little kid. But at a faculty party, at a faculty party, I was there, and so was another graduate student who I hadn't known at the time. I just got to UConn, and his name was Charles Hatfield. And we were looking at the books on the wall. And suddenly, at the same time, we both noticed the Smithsonian Book of Comic Book Comics. And we're like, well, that's interesting. And so we just kind of pulled it down. And then Lane, who's the partner of the professor, came over. And we just talked and talked and talked. And then Charles and I basically never stopped talking for about 25 years. And what happened was our conversations went from wasn't it cool when to isn't it interesting how? And that's when the wheels really started turning. And we had another friend, Kevin Cahill, who was into comics as well. He was in the master's program. And we decided, we'd heard about the Popular Culture Association, and the Northeast Popular Culture Association called for papers came out, and we said, let's put a comics panel together because we know how to talk about comics and nobody else does because we were young and stupid. So we went to this conference and it was just a dud. Nothing. They added 3 people to our 3-person panel and there were 4 people in the audience. It was just a nightmare. So, but then we said next year, let's go to the Popular Culture Association, the real one. And we went there and the scales fell from our eyes. We met Amy Nyberg, who was the chair of the PCA at the Comic Comics at the PCA at that time, who couldn't have been more welcoming to a overeager graduate student who didn't know what he was getting himself into. Tom Inge, John Lent, Rusty Wittick, all these people like this, because at that time, this is the mid '90s, there were almost no other places to present comics scholarship in a conference setting. There were very few. And PCA was kind of the main thing. And Charles was there for Renaissance and Restoration 18th century literature. I was at UConn for medieval studies, medieval literature. I was studying illuminated Old English manuscripts. And the more so I did all my coursework in that, and the more I was writing my prospectus for my dissertation, the more it became, I'm talking about comics without actually using comics. And Charles had gotten special dispensation to switch his topic to comics. And then a year later, I did the same thing. And we had a very tolerant department. There was one professor there, Tom Roberts, who had been teaching a comics and graphic novels class for a long time, but it was always a special topics class. And he was not graduate faculty, but they let him direct our dissertations, and things just kind of went from there. I was really interested. My first paper was on Superman, and then I moved in different directions. And that's kind of how it started. And then we developed the Comic Scholars Discussion List. I joined the board of, I was asked to join the International Comic Arts Festival, which then became the International Comic Arts Forum, and now it's something else, ICAF. And that's kind of how it started. And I remember that first PCA, there was a bunch of us in the bar, after it was all over, and we were sitting there going, wouldn't it be amazing if this was actually some kind of a field? We could maybe be the start of something. And 25 years later, it is a field, which is something that we were dreaming of, but never really thought was a possibility, I think. At least I was just kind of blue skying at the time.
Yeah, that's amazing. What a story. And that it's so, the coincidence of you and Charles being at the same university, but really like extraordinary, even the courage, the dedication to kind of be clearing these new spaces, both of you. And I know others were also kind of there. I know Bart Beatty was kind of doing his stuff as well, but you guys were really like, you know, the pioneers here. I know your dissertation in 2002, you wrote on McKay, Spiegelman, and Ware. I mean, gosh, that's extraordinary in and of itself, right? I mean, what an amazing thing. Tell me, you go from dissertation, really like carving new paths, to publishing articles, to this huge thing, 500 essential graphic novels, where you have 350 authors, 400 artists. Like tell me how you got through, you know, to this place.
Okay, well, it's a very strange, torturous journey. But after I got my dissertation, I taught for a few years, but teaching was not for me. And I had some health problems, and so I kind of took some time off from everything. And eventually this project kind of fell in my lap. This was a work for hire project. I did not seek this out. And I don't like the term graphic novel much at all, but it's a necessary evil.
Why, Gene? Before you keep, why?
Oh, because it's kind of an empty signifier. Ultimately, I mean, mostly it's a marketing term. I mean, it starts off with lofty expectations, depending on who you talk to, but eventually just becomes a marketing term. If Persepolis and a collection of 6 random issues of Amazing Spider-Man can both be labeled graphic novels, the only thing that unites them is the fact that they're comics long enough to have a spine. That's pretty much it. But again, the term helped the form get some purchase in especially libraries and eventually schools. And saying graphic novel somehow sounds more important to people than comic book. I'm very happy to use the word comics, but graphic novel has its uses. He admits grudgingly.
Yes, I'm with you. I'm totally with you. Yep. Yeah, so keep going. So this was handed to you. You're like, I'm going to go for this. I don't even know how it's possible, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, and it was really sort of impossible. I wound up not completing the project on my own. There was lots of help along the way. The book came with some restraints. The publisher wanted this to be a useful guide for readers. So that meant every book listed had to be in print, in English, at the time it published. So that kind of, I mean, this is the early 2000s. So that meant at that point, there was no Claire Bertochet in print. There was no Jacques Tardy in print in English. There was no Mobius in print in English. So there are huge gaps. I mean, that's just from one small part of Europe. But I mean, those were huge gaping holes that kind of hurt my heart to have in there. Also, there couldn't be much manga because they were planning a 500 essential manga book as well. So there were a lot of constraints placed on it. It's still interesting. I think my favorite part is still the introduction, where I talk about why I don't like the word graphic novel. But there's interesting stuff in there. It's not really things are in there kind of alphabetically, so they're broken down by genre, and then they're just kind of listed. So there's no like top 10 for each one, which I had planned on there being, things like that. I think it's still, people have told me it's a useful book, but it's not the book that I would have done if I had free reign.
Gotcha. So of what you were able to put together, and given that the limitations on that, what would you choose from these 500 essential graphic novels as your top bests?
That's a super hard question. Because my tastes are very Catholic, small c. They go everywhere. I do have a fondness for Mouse, which sounds trite, but I spent a lot of time working on Mouse. I wrote a chapter on my dissertation on Mouse. And it's formally brilliant. It's thematically significant. It's he does things visually that you don't realize you're reading it. He makes it so easy, and he was known before this for like things like breakdowns, where the page was like very convoluted, and he was like playing games to try to keep people on the same page for as long as he possibly could, things like that. All those games are still in Mouse, but they're subsumed to the narrative in such a way that it's formally complex, but it's still accessible. It moved beyond just a game. And I really like that. And the other book, you asked me about that, but I couldn't not put Linda Berry on here also. I'm not sure if there was any Linda Berry in print at the time that I did that book either. But the Freddie Stories by Linda Berry is, I love Mouse with my brain, but I love the Freddie Stories with my heart. The story itself is so powerful, and it's powerful, it's nuanced, and it's really, really heartbreaking. And it's just, as a narrative, it does so much. And I've tried to write about Linda Berry several times. In fact, you had Lisa Kirtley on this podcast, and she mentioned she was at a conference giving a paper on Linda Berry. I was sitting next to her on that panel. And that was the first time I think I was trying to write about her. And basically I couldn't write an analytic essay about her. I basically wound up saying Linda Berry is really cool, and here's why. Because I can articulate what is interesting to look at a page of Mouse, but Linda Berry, for a lot of reasons, it's very, very visceral. Her work is very visceral to me.
Yeah, I love that. There are just some things in the world that resist us putting that analytical sort of scaffolding around.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about it, but mostly it's just everything I've read from her. The very first thing I read from her actually was in Raw Volume 2, edited by Spiegelman and Francois Mouly. So, I mean, there's a connection there also, but just the way her brain works is unlike anyone. And I was lucky enough to take a one-day drawing seminar with her last summer, and that was a gift to be in the presence for a full day.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Really amazing. There's another area, and maybe this gets back to your kind of studies, medieval studies, and sort of deep interest in, the text, right? The illuminated text, researching fonts and lettering. Now, you and I both know how important both are. And in fact, DC and Marvel have, their fonts and lettering are so recognizable, they don't even need to put DC or Marvel, right? Et cetera. But tell me what you've discovered in your research.
What I was impressed with when I started writing about comics and looking into comics is that, I'll back up. A lot of people, when they were talking about comics, especially in the 90s, were coming from a literature studies background. And they were talking about the text, by which they meant the narrative. They meant the story. And I was interested in the story and the visuals. And at some point, especially when I started working on Chris Ware, is when I realized that the text is a visual itself. It's not a transparent medium for communication. It's a vital part of the comics page. I think of comics in some ways like poetry. If you can change the font in poetry generally, and it doesn't change that much, but you can't change the line breaks. The poem has to look like it does. And that's to me kind of analogous in comics. If two people letter something, it looks different, it will read differently, just because of either formal ideas or little idiosyncratic quirks. On the slide that we've got up here, down at the bottom, very small, I've got a page from an X-Men comic lettered by Tom Warzakowski. And in the 80s, 90s, that was X-Men. I mean, he did other things too, but that was such an identifying mark of an X-Men comic. If he didn't letter an issue, it looked so strange. It was very odd. But then I started to look into it, kind of the history of it and things like that. And I've got Todd Klein, who's just an absolute master. And I first noticed his work, really noticed his work in Sandman, because he developed an individual representative typeface for every one of the Endless. Every one of the Endless speaks in a different visual style. And that was fascinating to me because you start to hear the differences in their tone of voice by what the text that's coming out of their mouth actually looks like. And I was also interested in lettering because as kind of if the comics page is a map, the text often is the roads on that map to tell you where to go when. Layout does that, but lettering often plays a very big role in that. And if lettering is not done thoughtfully, it can actually confuse things. Even though the words are correct, if they're not in the right place, it can confuse what you're actually looking at. So I've got that. I've got a page of early Fantastic Four here. Artie Simek was maybe the first letterer that I noticed even when I was a kid reading comics. The way that he letters, you can see the display lettering there, the sleeper strikes, those kind of the jagged ends. They're not really serifs, but they're kind of the little jagged tooth marks in his capitals there is a hallmark. Everything is very straightforward. It's almost like Orzechowski and Simek in my mind are connected, sort of, just because Simek is so regimented and so regular, but also when he does his display lettering, it's really interesting as well. Plus, when he's working on Fantastic Four, especially, he's got to deal with Stan Lee putting 7,000 words in a panel, and he's got to figure out how to make all that fit without killing too much of the Kirby artwork. So he's doing a lot of heavy lifting there also. And then the last example I threw here was Linda Berry, of course. But what she's been doing, especially more recently, is working in collage and using found text also. So this image we've got here, we've got her own drawing, her own lettering, things that she's cut up from old books, old textbooks, old student reports, things like that. And so she's using that. Really, she could rewrite those words, but if she rewrote the words, it wouldn't have the same effect as actually using the physical manifestation of those words from their original context. It marks it as other, but also she's trying to balance everything out. And I just love the kind of tensions and the ways that the page kind of flows together. And the juxtaposition of things makes you stop and question things a little more.
Yeah, I love it. I was just at a module with my students about, the importance of lettering. And well, there are a lot of comics that want us to kind of read through and don't want to kind of stop us at that kind of moment of the letter.
Right.
But then there are these extraordinary examples that you've just given, and the significance in the shaping of the story of lettering is just, mind-blowing. It's such a rich area of research. Now, speaking of which, Chris Ware. So here you are, dissertation. Obviously, he grabbed you. And then you go on and do more work in terms of his tools and visual storytelling. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with Chris Ware?
The very first issue of Acme Novelty Library that he published, I remember seeing the cover in previews, and I thought, this looks interesting. So I pre-ordered it. I don't think I even put together in my head that he had been in a few issues of Raw before that. I got this book, and it blew my mind with just all the formal intricacies, the attention to detail, the attention to design, not just of the pages, which are often, as you can see even here on the Quimby the Mouse page, playing with sequence in really interesting ways, but also just the package design itself. Like the hardcover Quimby the Mouse there. I love that you open it up. The middle is a star map. with I can't remember, is this the one where the star map actually has light sensitive things on it? If you charge the page, you can see the stars in the dark, I think. I'm not positive on that. But every square inch of a Chris Ware publication is designed to a T. And I started to liken him a little bit to almost like artist books. Although this stuff is mass produced, but the careful attention that he puts into everything was just so profound to me. I hadn't seen anything quite like that before. I've seen things similar. I mean, he was influenced by Richard McGuire, Little Yo Swart, a lot of 1930s cartoons and things like that. But the way he was able to put all those elements together, and like you can even see on that Quimby the Mouse page, the second tier of panels, and is really large. In the third and the bottom, the last full tier, we can see so. So he's using these simple transition words that are, it's not like Batman Pow Zap, but it's a kind of graphic punctuation. The word means something, but the way it looks and where it's placed and how it starts to set a new scene, all this stuff is really fascinating to me. And I was lucky enough to, the one time I was able to visit Lambic, the comic shop in, how am I forgetting the name of the city? Blanking on that. But the city in Europe, I can't believe I'm blanking on the name, but they happen to have a show of Chris Ware's art in their small gallery. This is like 1998 or something like that. And I was amazed to see like this page of Quimby the Mouse. I'm not sure if this page was there or not, but everything there was hand drawn, including the display lettering. Things that I could have sworn were either old stencils or computer printed even at that point. Everything was hand drawn. And it was just Amsterdam is a city. Finally remembered. But everything was hand drawn, and that just increased my appreciation for it all the more. And I did buy double copies of some of the books so that I could I could cut out the little toys and build the little robots and houses and things like that.
Such a range of interests and tastes, right? You have Linda Barry, and then you have Chris Ware. You know, these are very very different kinds of comic.
Even in the McLeod pyramid, they would be pretty far apart.
No, but it's great. Ware with his kind of surgical, precise, storytelling. You've also done work on comic strips, Peanuts. Tell us about this.
Peanuts is in my DNA. Actually, it was my brother in grade school. My brother would buy all the Peanuts collections from the Scholastic Book Service monthly mailing thing. And so we had Peanuts just around the house constantly. Every lunch was eating chicken soup and reading a Peanuts book at the same time. That was pretty much every lunch for me. And it's just always been there. And when Schultz passed away, Tom Inge, who again, to go back to Susan Kirtley's interview, Tom Inge was so influential in getting her to write that Linda Barry book. He invited myself and Charles Hatfield and a couple of other people to do a panel commemorating Charles Schultz at the Modern Language Association conference. And it was an honor to be asked. It was the craziest panel I've ever been on because the room was huge and they were turning people away. I was interviewed for the New York Times, we all were. So we were in the New York Times because of this panel about Peanuts. And also we got put on Lynn Cheney's shit list for her excellence in academia or something like that. There was every year they would post sanity missing at sanity MIA at MLA. And she would list the titles of the papers that were frivolous and not worthwhile. And our panel got listed on that. So that was actually a badge of pride for me. And when Tom asked me to write something about Peanuts, I didn't know what to write about the strip itself, but because we were kind of doing a retrospective, it's like, it's been so influential. And what I thought was really influential was just how many times it's been parodied and how well some people are actually able to pull it off. And one of my favorite comics of all time is good old Gregor Brown, R. Sikoriak's adaptation of Kafka's Metamorphosis using peanut strips. It's brilliant, and it does everything it needs to do. Sikoriak is brilliant because he not only he knows the source material, he knows how to draw something that looks like another comic, but what he really can do, he can think like those cartoonists that he can draw like. So the rhythms of the storytelling and stuff like that, it's not just stylistic mimicry, it's narrative sensibility mimicry, which is, I think, much harder to do, actually. So anyways, since that was stuck in my mind, that kind of, I couldn't, once I had the idea, I couldn't shake it. And luckily, and very nicely, Jared Gardner and Ian Gordon included a version of this paper in their book on peanuts that came out a few years ago. And that was a real honor because I was never expecting to do anything with that. And Jared especially did a lot of work to help me through that.
Yeah, well, it's so important to think about influence, not just influence on creators, which is the typical kind of story, but how creators are influencing cultural phenomena today, right? So important. Now, Gene, you're one of these kind of extraordinary people who, can have the scholarly hat and then you have the creative hat, and you've got this comics machine going on. But in particular, you seem driven to create abstract comics. I have one of them that you so kindly sent me. Tell me about this. And I know there was a moment when you had some kind of challenges, difficulties even with that creative side of yourself.
The creative side was actually the academic creative side. For a while, I could not write whatsoever. And that was kind of a big crisis, which kind of leads to this in a strange way, because I found myself at a really, really horrible telephone job. And to keep myself sane, I had a little stress ball and I would just scratch stuff. I would just write tiny little things or whatever. And one day I sketched something that looked like a panel. I put something else next to it. And before I knew it, I had this thing that looked kind of like a comics page, but there was nothing representational on it. It was using panels. It was using speech balloons. It used things that look more like text and things that look more like things, but because I couldn't concentrate that well. And when I did that, I did a couple more of those, and I was like, well, this is kind of interesting. But then I did nothing with it for many years again, but it was always just kind of there. And but in the back of my mind, what I was thinking was that what I'm doing is I'm trying to create comics as if, like, say, the man from Mars comes to Earth and sees this thing that Earth people call comics, goes back to Mars and uses the formal language of comics, but uses the languages, the idioms, the cultural visual metaphors of their own culture. So basically, I want this to look like something that somebody's seen comics, but they have a totally different reference set than we do. And also, I don't think I can draw very well, and I don't know how to write fiction. So this is a really interesting way to create things that look like comics. And what I wound up doing eventually, at first I was just kind of messing around. If you want to go to the next slide.
Yep.
Oh, I don't even have that. Okay. I forgot to put one in, I guess. Oh yeah, this one. Sorry. I put these the wrong way. Yep. Yeah. I was doing things that looked kind of like that first one there for a while, which was very rough and things like that. But I was just trying to understand what was going on. If we go back again now, I'm sorry, I'm jumping back and forth here.
No problem.
For you. Several years ago, it was a Saturday night. I was home alone. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and I said, I want to make one of those comics again. And I didn't actually live tweet it, but on Facebook, I started with the one on the left here, and I started sketching something out, and like every 15 minutes, I would take a picture of what happened. And eventually I wound up with this, which I didn't know what it was, but it looked it looked kind of like what I wanted it to look like, whatever that means. Andre Molitou was kind enough to put this up on his Abstract Comics blog, and I thought, I've hit the big time. I'm never going to have anything published again. But this is great. This was fantastic. And this page actually, especially, is influenced a lot by Steve Bissett, who used to come and give guest lectures at the University of Connecticut back when Charles and I were students. And one thing that Steve was always stressed was the importance of leading the person's eye along the page. I don't have anything here, but so basically that page on the left started with a kind of a loose line that kind of snaked back and forth, and then I just tried to make up anything that would seem to fit along that line. And then after I was done, I kind of realized that it's a very loose adaptation of the movie Prometheus, which I hate, but it can be read that way, which I didn't even realize as I was doing it. But it was really fun to do that. And so the next thing I did was a large piece. This was an 8.5 by 11. The next one I did a large piece. Oops, sorry, if you can just stay on that one before. Yeah, that one. And the next thing I did, which is another focus of mine, is Charles Atlas comics, The Insult That Made a Man Out of Mac. So this is my version of The Insult That Made a Man Out of Mac. The first episode, the first thing there is, of course, the bully kicking sand in their faces. But again, I'm trying to use things that were suggestive of the original drawings or the content of those drawings without actually drawing real people or real words. So that's kind of where that comes from.
Yeah, really amazing. Can you break this one down for me?
Yeah. Okay. In 2015, I moved to Evanston, Illinois from Albany, New York to take a job at Northwestern's library. And I moved in like November of 2014. New Year's Day 2015, I went to a party and someone asked, they were just going on, what was your New Year's resolution? And I said, I don't make resolutions because I never keep them, but I do wish I would draw more. And I went home and I drew a thing that was kind of comics-like. And I said, maybe I'll just do one of these every day. Maybe that's my resolution. And that was insane, but I wound up doing it. 365 days in a row, I did either a strip like this or a page. And again, they start off really rough like that one you saw before, and they ended a lot differently. But I would occasionally do things that were my versions of other things, kind of like the Charles Atlas thing. And when I saw the Charlie Brown, because every Sunday I would do a daily comic strip, this before panel thing like that, because I'm perverse. So Sundays would be a daily strip. And they started to link together somehow. There were recurring characters and stuff. And I've just always loved this very first Peanuts comic strip because it encapsulates everything about that character. It's so heartbreaking, even that very first one. Charlie Brown is walking along. He's purely oblivious to the hate that people feel for him. He's fine with himself. This is before the world beats him down too much, but people just the casual cruelty behind that. And I thought, well, maybe I could do something like that. So I tried to use my characters, quote unquote, and do something that reminded me of that. And I actually did a second one, which is the very final daily strip of Peanuts. I did a version of that one as well.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I did a lot of other things like that. So I mean, if you know what it's supposed to be, you can kind of tell. But the proportions and things are off. But so it's kind of really filtered through whatever it is in my brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. It's where you're using your imagination to imagine something and things and entities and recreate emotions, situations that are unimagined, and that takes a huge creative brain. Let's talk about this next slide and your kind of journal, how you create these images.
Well, this is actually the longest book that I've done, called Codex with a Q, because I'm pretentious. But what happened was I got the little booklet you see on the left, was from the local printer who sometimes makes remnant books just to get rid of their stuff, and they're called Quartet. So I got this book, and it's covered with Q's because it was Quartet. And I got the book, and that little the little blue Q in the middle there, I was just fooling around with my brush pen, and I filled in a little circle inside the Q. I was like, that's kind of interesting. And then I drew what you see on the left, on the right, on the very first page. And it wasn't supposed to be anything except just another one of my comics. But I looked at it and I thought, this looks like the start of something, possibly. And so I vowed to fill every page of this book, and when it was done, I would have a graphic novel or a graphic novelette, or at least something that pretends to somehow present a kind of continuing narrative. Because mostly everything I had done before were just standalone pages. This page and this page, everything kind of stood alone. And so this page kind of established everything I needed to do. It's got portions of that Q character, and there's at least one Q on every single page. I broke the book down into, I think, 6 chapters, and every chapter is imagined as a double page spread. So you can see on this one here, you can see that the outline on the left-hand side of that page, and then the next page would face it and have another border on the other side. So I was always seeing these things as double page spreads in my head. So every chapter had similar kinds of borders, but each border was different from every chapter was different from everything else. Every page in the book, except for one, has that little squiggly, not quite Cocopelli character you see down at the bottom. And it just became really interesting. And the other thing about the comics is that when I said I did one a day in 2015, I would have stopped probably after 3 days, because I'm not really that good with follow through on a lot of projects. But I started putting things on Facebook, and I started getting a lot of responses. And it was not like I have to satisfy my public, but people are enjoying this. I'm enjoying that people are enjoying this. Let's see where it goes. And just getting feedback was really helpful, because I didn't plan to do anything with this stuff. I was just an experiment for myself. But it became a lot of fun. And this book became a short book. And I was invited to do a read when I published it, because all this stuff is self-published. When I said I was going to publish it, a local friend named Karen Kring, she said, I would like to set up like a book reading, like a book launch party. You could do a reading. And I said, I can't do a reading of this. There are no words. How do I do that? But Brian Cremens, who's another great comic scholar, another UConn alum, who was there as Charles and I were finishing, Brian was getting going. His book on Captain Marvel is amazing. He should be a guest if you haven't had him already. I don't think you have. But he is a good friend, and his partner, Allison, Brian's a great musician, and Allison's a great musician and singer. And Allison had recently was part of a choral performance where they sang wordless songs, just kind of la 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 la's, but like things that were composed. They're like, what if we did like a slideshow of the book, and you guys did some of that wordless music in the background? And because in my mind, that was perfect. And then Brian ran off and wrote 20 minutes of brand new songs with actual words, which I wasn't expecting. But the first time we kind of did a test run through it, they invited me to their studio. And I realized that making people look at things that don't make sense for 20 minutes while hearing things that don't make sense for 20 minutes is cool in the abstract, but in reality, it would just be excruciating for the audience. You got to give them something. So now I'm thinking more in terms of the audience. And so I think of the music as kind of like this lead life preserver. When people are hearing the words, they think it's reflecting on the story, but it really has nothing to do with it. Mostly what it does is try and sequence the song so that sonically this song feels like this chapter at this time, or this page spread and things like that. So and he had 4 guitars and 11 effects pedals on stage with him when he did it, and Allison had a drum and some vocal effects. It was a lot of fun. It was really amazing. So the fact that this little squiggle book allowed them to create this 20-minute suite of songs, it just amazes me.
Yeah, I love it. So tell us, you've already kind of talked about, some of your work. Maybe you can walk us through a little bit of you get the how you get the idea, and then how it becomes a material reality on the page.
Okay, this is a two-page spread from an upcoming anthology that I was asked to participate in. So this hasn't been published yet, hopefully by the end of the year, but maybe not because this year makes no sense. But one of the things that I started doing a couple of years ago, I finally bought myself an iPad Pro. And so I've been working digitally sometimes as well as with the actual brush pen. So this was done all digitally, but this kind of shows you how I start. Everything always starts, almost everything, with a layout. I'm interested in page layouts, and so I'm looking at ways to just create a design of a page somehow, and then I'll figure out what goes in it later. But first, I need to get a new thing, and I'm interested in overlaps and kind of confusing the reader as to where they might go. And this is a luxury you can do because when you don't have actual text, because like when you get to that circle panel down there, you probably get that circle panel from reading the top panel, then going straight down on the left. You get to that circle panel. Where do you go next? Well, the overlap, normally you would go to the right, but at the same time, that circle panel overlaps the bottom. So it's like two different possible paths you can take at the same time. So again, I'm just playing a lot of like baby Spiegelman games with page layout and stuff like that. So I got to something that I thought was kind of interesting, and then I wound up doing what you see on the left-hand side of the page of the two-page spread there. And I probably started with the big circle because that was obviously going to be a focal point. So I wanted that to be really contrasty to really draw your eye to that. And then there was a big open space, so I had to throw in some kind of texty thing. And a little Kirby crackle at the bottom, just because, and just kind of trying to have things that kind of match to each other. If nothing else, this one is about kind of like using different tones and having those tones kind of resonate with each other somehow. And then I realized, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Gene, that your earlier reflection about how you kind of respond and how Linda Berry resonates with you on that kind of almost visceral level, your comics are kind of asking us to do the same thing, right?
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I honestly don't really know what I want people to think about them, but anytime anybody says anything about what they're looking at, it always surprises and delights me, because they will see things that clearly have to be there that were never in my head at all. Or I may have had a kind of idea that guided me through that nobody picks up on, but they pick up on other things as well. But thank you for that. So I knew that the piece I had to do was I had 2 pages to play with. So I thought, well, why don't I do a double-page spread instead of two standalone pieces, but they kind of talk to each other. So basically, I took that first layout, I flipped it upside down, and so that's the recto page there. And then I tried to use kind of the same tonal values and color and things like that, and have a couple things kind of rhyme with each other visually. I mean, the second one has a little more kind of not even an architectural or kind of like a landscape feel to it, where the first one was kind of just like kind of pure energy, sort of. There's some of that there, and the circle on the left-hand page there is something that I've been is a kind of a drawing style that I've been playing with also, with these very lush brush squiggles with little extras things on. I call them puddles of ink.
Beautiful. Puddles of ink. So, I mean, you've kind of gone through all of this, but can you tell us, I mean, why the decision not to really have, you talked about kind of coming from another planet and so on, but can you go into that a little bit more about the kind of lack of our capacity to parse meaning through recognizable language?
Again, it starts off purely from a perceived liability on my part that I didn't have anything to say, but I wanted these comics to look like other comics. So they had to have some kind of text-like things in them. And I've gradually developed like 3 or 4 different alphabets, quote unquote, they're not like, these aren't like substitution ciphers or anything like that. There is no conscious attempt to have these things translate to anything in particular. Some people have tried, and it doesn't work because there's not a large enough vocabulary for any of them. But what it allows me to do is to think of image purely as design, of text purely as design. So it becomes an embedded element, just like everything else on the page. And also, like I said, when I'm playing with layouts and things like that, where your eye may or may not go, because there's no semantic value behind any of this stuff, your eye can go where it wants to, and you're not penalized by reading something out of order, because there is no set order. I really think of these things as kind of a whole construct.
A kind of gestalt.
Exactly, yeah. And what I hadn't realized at first, until I think it was Andre again who told me the term saamic text. I was just drawing squiggles that look like text. But there's a whole very rich tradition of this. If people know, the Voynich manuscript is maybe the most famous example of this. Manuscript that could be many centuries old, maybe not as many centuries old, and it looks like it's kind of an herbarium, but no one's been able to decipher it. And it probably is indecipherable, and it seems to be a saamic. It really looks like somebody was trying really hard to make this look like it meant something. But it probably does not.
So, Gene, as we kind of move through our conversation, you're a scholar, you're a creator. How do you bring this into your classroom?
Well, that's a good question, because, again, the last time I taught was 15 years ago, and I was not drawing comics then. So this fall, in a couple of weeks, I'll be back in the classroom again for the first time. Well, in the virtual classroom because COVID. And I'm teaching in an art history department instead of literature. So I'm kind of looking for the students to look at the development of these forms. And one way that I want to do that is to try to look at the different publishing histories of things that have been called graphic novels, or things that were not called graphic novels, but kind of can be read that way. So we're going to be looking at a lot of things that, in hindsight, might be considered a graphic novel, plus things that just people haven't seen before. Because of my interests kind of go everywhere. Whenever I'm in a used bookstore, I'm always looking in the graphic novel section, which they have one now, or the humor section, or the art section, for things that just I've never seen before, but that seem comics-like. And because, again, what I do is comics-like. It's comics, but with no real words. It's not exactly the same thing. So I basically, for the last 5 years, I've been playing visually, and I want my students to do that as well, intellectually, and hopefully that will translate into their actual artistic practice as well. I'm sure most of them already do that anyways, but again, I'm learning things about, I learned a lot about comics from making comics, things that I hadn't considered before. And again, just so what I'm hoping is to get a lot of ideas out there for the students to see, and they're going to synthesize things differently. I mean, my essays on lettering, my essay on lettering is somehow embedded in every page of comics that I draw right now. Peanuts is in the DNA, so to speak. Obviously, Spiegelman and Ware and McKay, things like that. Linda Berry is the angel who's kind of blessing every mark I make. So it's more about just kind of showing possibilities. I'm not going to tell them the history of the graphic novel. That's why the course is called Histories of the Graphic Novel. I want them to look at basically origin stories, and how those origin stories are often determined or overdetermined by market forces, by competing or coexisting cultural movements of the time. So we're going to talk about Tijuana Bibles. We're going to talk, because Tijuana Bibles are like the first direct market. And direct market kind of leads to Marvel and DC and other people doing standalone graphic novels. And so there's a whole long thing that you can do there. But I'm going to start off in the next panel, the next slide, just kind of does one thing. Usually when I've taught comics before, I've kind of always used Chris Ware's Thrilling Adventure Stories, or I Guess, as a way to get them into the idea of comics as a form. Because this story, it's a 6-page story, this is just the first and last page, is incredible because the pictures tell a very trite superhero mad scientist story, but the text is all about a young boy's reminiscence of his mother's of living with his mother and the horrible father figures from his grandfather to boyfriends and things that are brought into his life. And it's really heartbreaking. And the first time I read it, the first several times I read it, I was like, I couldn't follow the text because I kept wanting to make one-to-one distinctions. I mean, the final panel on the last page there, but that was okay with me because I like things better when it was just my mom and me anyway. That's you can read that ironically once you've gone through the whole thing, but just to parse out those sentences, I typed out the whole story so I could do that. And then as the more I've studied it, and again, Charles Hatfield helped me a lot with this also, you start to see that there are little connections that you can make, thematic connections or tonal connections between the text and the images. So even though they don't literally match up, there's these other things. So I use this as a way to kind of get students to think about the complexity of comics. It's not just here's the picture and here's the text that tells you what's happening. There can be a lot more complex ways to think about these things. And genre plays a big part also. I mean, the superhero genre brings with it expectations. So like you start off with an origin story, you clearly what it looks like there. And it's really the boy's origin story. He thought that because of old movies, until I was 6 or 7, I thought color was some kind of weird modern invention because the past was in black and white. And I was the same way as a kid, actually. And I thought, when I was a kid, I thought that in the old days you could see wind because I was always watching like Westerns and things like that. And you can see the dust flowing by. And it's like, oh, you could see the wind then. So so we kind of got the idea of the little kid trying to understand the world, and the next 6 pages are him trying to understand a world that doesn't make sense, and he's trying to put it together into this black and white story. There's good, there is bad. You have a hero and you have a villain, but real life doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I love it. I'm sure your class is going to be a huge success. Gene, as we wind down here, where are you seeing the vitality in comics today, comic studies today?
Well, the vitality of comics itself, I mean, you picked a perfect weird old photo of me because this is me at the Cake convention, the Chicago Alternative Comics Expo that happens until this year, every year. And it's a complete small press thing. I mean, there are some larger publishers like Fantagraphics, but the energy of seeing young people and some not so young people just doing things with comics completely because they want to, because they see it as a form. I mean, people like men of my age became comic scholars, I think, in large part because they grew up reading this stuff. Whereas women of my age don't have that same kind of visceral connection to it, so they come at it through different, often through different avenues, and we're looking for different things. So my stuff still looks pretty traditional. I mean, I love Linda Berry, but I learned from Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, so my stuff still kind of has that kind of a regularized layout. No matter how strange it might be, it still looks like that. But we've got a whole generation of people now who grew up with manga or grew up with web comics. Web comics is, again, a really vital place because anybody can do anything. I mean, the great thing about comics is that you need a pencil and paper and a photocopier. With web comics, if you've got a computer, you don't even need the photocopier part. You don't have to put any money into it. You can just put stuff out there and things will happen. And that's where I see a lot of vitality, but also established creators who continue to reinvent themselves. It's just really amazing to me that 25 years ago, I was lucky to learn about cartoonists from other countries because I was on an international mailing list that comics people gravitated to. But you can see everything right now. And a convention like this, you see so much that's going on. And the vitality is really just the people embracing the form, not not telling certain kinds of stories. I mean, that's important too, but just people are doing whatever they want, and their influences are either not comics at all, or they're comics that they grew up reading, which may have been zines or web comics or things themselves. It's really exciting. Plus, at the same time, you've got this huge backlog of classic books, comic strip collections, things like that, all in print at the same time. It's never been like this before. So, and if you want to, you can see the whole 21st century history of comics in a good bookstore, and that's or a good library, and that's phenomenal. And I think that's generative also. People having access to things just makes everything more interesting.
And maybe that,
comic studies, it's hard to even know that's.
Well, I was going to say, you kind of answered that, with the amazing abundance of comics that are out there and sort of, access to, gosh, we can go anywhere and everywhere. And it seems like, we are.
Oh yeah. 25 years ago, I could and did own pretty much everything published in America on comics from university presses, and that was a very short half shelf. There was almost nothing. And now between the monographs, edited collections, several presses have comics lines, so many journals. It used to be able to, I kind of used to know everybody in the field. I don't think it's possible for anybody to know everybody in the field right now, because it is a field, and people can take this in any direction. And the thing I love about comics and comic studies is that it is inherently interdisciplinary. Again, when I started off, the majority of people were coming from English departments, and that is not the case anymore. And comics should have invited this all along. But I think we're really getting there now, where people, no matter what your theoretical perspective is, or your however you develop your scholarly apparatus, there are things in comics that you can talk about. You can read comics from 60 years ago very differently now than you read them then. There's so much opportunity and so much variety, and again, the variety of people looking at comics is so much greater than it used to be also, and that all of that is exciting to me.
Gosh, Gene, what can I say? Thank you for sharing a little sliver of your journey as a scholar, as a creator, and as a teacher. Thank you, Gene.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a real honor and a pleasure.
Brilliant. Okay, we're going to